Okay, I think we're ready to start. And for those of you online, thank you for being patient. Welcome to the Poetry Room at City Lights, and to all of you here as well. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush peoples. Always an honor and a privilege to do so. So we're so delighted to have Martha S. Jones with us celebrating The Trouble of Color, an American family memoir, which is produced by our friends at Basic Books, who City Lights has a very long-standing relationship with. Professor Jones is a prize-winning scholar of Black history, and in The Trouble of Color, she delves deeply into her family's past, unearthing its layers of history from rural Kentucky and a small town in Northern Carolina to New York City and its suburbs. And Professor Jones offers us a very lyrical and deeply felt meditation on some of the most fundamental matters involving identity, belonging, and family. Professor Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a prize-winning author and editor of 4 books, her most recent being Vanguard. She is past co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians and has contributed to the New York Times, The Atlantic, and many other publications. And she makes her home in Baltimore, Maryland. So joining her in conversation tonight is Dylan C. Penningroth. He is, of course, no stranger to City Lights. We've hosted both of them in the past, but in a virtual context. So it's just really such an honor and a pleasure to actually have you here in the flesh, here in the Poetry Room. Professor Penningroth is Professor of Law and Alexander F. and May T. Morrison Professor of History, as well as Associate Dean in the Program in Jurisprudence and Social Policy and Legal Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. He's a recipient of the Avery Craven Prize from the Organization of American Historians. His articles have appeared in the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, the Journal of American History, amongst others. He is the author of Before the Movement, The Hidden History of Civil Rights. So we're going to have a Q&A towards the end of this. And for those of you online, we ask that you post your questions and comments in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. We're also going to be posting links there with which you may purchase books. So please join us in giving Martha S. Jones and Dylan C. Penningroth a warm welcome. Welcome to City Lights.
Well, that is just a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Martha, for allowing me to do this event with you. I think I'd better just kind of underscore a little bit the kind of scholar that we have here today with us. Martha's book, Birthright Citizens, won the John Philip Reed Book Prize from the American Society of Legal History, the Littleton Griswold Prize from the American Historical Association, and the Liberty Legacy Foundation Award. And her most recent book, Vanguard, her second most recent book, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, won the LA Times Book Prize. And I think you said that you were just coming from the ceremony.
I was just coming from that extravaganza, in LA.
It's wonderful. So this is truly an incredible and serious historian. And I'm going to come back to that just sort of the credentials that Martha Jones possesses as a scholar, a PhD historian, because it matters for what we're going to talk about in this conversation. Last, I just want to say that Martha is also a dear friend. And I am just thrilled to have the chance to talk with
Thank you, friend.
About this new book, The Trouble of Color, an American family memoir. So I'm going to start off with a big picture softball question. What motivated you to write this book?
So thanks, Dylan, for doing this with me. Secretly, I've wanted to talk to you about this book for a very long time. So here we are. I want to thank Peter and City Lights. It's true that we've done things together, but this is my first time in the shop, and those in the room know what an amazing venue this is, and the walls are teeming with poetry all around us. For the folks online, it's really extraordinary to be here. In my family, I'm the pack rat. I'm the online family tree author. So I come by, I think, really honestly, an interest in family history. And that might be enough. But what really led me to go beyond, late nights, going through the census returns and going through figuring out who's in the old photos and all the things that we do as family historians, I began to encounter other historians, not unlike me, who were writing about people in my family and not getting the story quite right. I discovered my grandfather in an encyclopedia. He had been, for most of his adult life, the president of a historically black college in North Carolina called Bennett College. And so it's not a surprise to find him in an encyclopedia. The surprise was that when I did, he was described as a white businessman from Atlanta. And I thought, well, what on earth is that? I know that, first of all, my grandfather had never been a businessman, but maybe that's beside the point. I knew that he wasn't white, but I also understood how it was that, a diligent but researcher, but a newcomer to him, might mistake him for what he was not. And in that moment, sort of erase all of the history that explained how he came to be the head of this historically black college in Greensboro. And so partly I thought the book was going to be about setting the record straight, but it turned out really that moment for me helped me to see myself in him, to see him in me, and to be drawn to trying to tell a fuller family story about color, about misapprehension, and the troubles, as the title suggests, that attend that. So I think in the end, I was less interested in the historians and more interested in the family. Yeah.
It really comes through on the page. And at the same time, it's clear to me, and we'll come back to this, that when you write about color, race, you're writing informed by a deep immersion in scholarship and theory on race. And so one of the sort of now taken for granted facts about race is that it's a social construction, not a biological fact. And a long and distinguished line of historians have taught us that race has to be made and remade in particular historical contexts. And one of your core arguments is that the color line was never solid. It was, and I'll just quote here, it was jagged, sharp-edged, and threatening. The book opens with one such jagged moment. On your first day of college at SUNY, I think it's New Paltz, is that right? With a fellow student named Ron. So I wonder if, could you set the scene briefly and tell us what happened?
Sure. Like a lot of young people, my first semester at college is my first time not only away from home in a prolonged way, but it's also the first time I'm outside of familiar circles where people know me, they know my family, they know what they think we are, who they think we are. I'm now in a completely new setting and wonderfully meeting new people, but also meeting people who are, as we do with one another, sizing me up for the very first time. And Ron is a classmate. He's a leader in the Black Student Union. It's 1976. It's important to place it in time, which is to say, we're still living the echoes of Black Power and civil rights. And we are studying Black sociology with a young professor. And I'm assigned to read Frantz Fanon's A Dying Colonialism. And I'm way out of my depths, right? But that's what I'm there for. I'm a Black Studies minor, and I'm there to learn. But when I sort of take the front of the room, a little bit like we are here, and I begin to, I'm holding little index cards. You remember, some of us remember index cards, not everybody, but yeah, you go, little index cards. And I begin haltingly this presentation, and Ron stands up and interrupts me and speaks really to the professor, not to me. But his challenge is clear. He has sized me up and thinks I am out of place and not someone who should be standing in a Black Studies class interpreting or even reciting the ideas of a great Black intellectual. And it is a painful moment. It is a moment that is immediately seared into my psyche because I've never been called out in such a formal way or challenged in such a formal way. But it's an important and defining moment for me because as those kinds of scenes can be, I realize that while I think he was not gentle, he was telling me something I needed to know, that I was now in the world, and that as we do, people were going to size me up as we size one another up, that they were not going to see me as the person I thought I was. They were going to see me through different eyes, and that was going to be part of my experience again and again and again and again. So can I tell you a funny story? Of course. Because it goes to your first point about what is race. So not so many weeks ago, I was in Montgomery, Alabama, and we went to Brian Stevenson's Legacy Museum, and folks know something about what that is. And there's a lunch spot there, Panny George's, which is part of the ritual. You go and you have your Southern food, cafeteria style at Panny George's. So we're in line at Panny George's, and there are two young women standing behind us. One appears to be a Black American and the other white American. And they're chattering, and we're waiting for our turn, and then I feel somebody tapping me from behind. And they say, we have a question. We want to ask you something. Can we ask you a question? And I'm thinking, this never works well for me when people have questions, but they're lovely, right? They're lovely. So I say yes. And they say, we want to ask you about your skin. Now, at this point, in my head, I hear, da-dung, right, here we go, right? They're going to ask me something about race, about color. I'm having a lovely day. I don't really want to do this. But again, they're lovely, they're smiling. And then they begin to speak, and I realize that they are interested in my skincare routine. And they are asking me about like my retinol and my sunscreen and what products I use. And I am I'm flabbergasted, and the part that is really about what is race is how on earth could I explain to them what has just happened, right, from where I sit, right? That they really, they keep saying, your skin is glowing, ma'am. I'm a woman of a certain age. And why would I introduce like the twisted idea, but really I think the twisted lie that is race, and put that between us, right? And insert that in this sort of really lovely, ordinary moment. And that's really the trouble, right? Is that this is the specter that is always sort of haunting me, but apparently not them. And I really love that.
Well, it as you show during the pages, it haunts you because it has happened to you, and it's happened to family members of yours. And I just want to come back to the words that Ron spat at you. He said, "Who do you think you are?" That's kind of the quotation that opens the book. Who do you think you are? When I read that, by the way, I jumped out of my chair and I said, well, who do you think you are? As someone who, I myself, have faced this question my whole life. And so I think that what the answer that you give soon afterward, and this kind of frames the book, you say that my best answer emanates from a single idea, family. So I guess I could ask, like, what do you mean by that? But what I really want to ask you is, what do you mean when you say that family is an idea?
Sure. The tough thing about Ron's question, if it really, of course it was rhetorical, it wasn't really meant for me to give an answer, but the answer would have been, that in order to know me, you have to know the people I come from. But it turned out, as I very deliberately try and conceive this book and try and write that family story, that there isn't a family story at all, right? There are many family stories. And that part of what family is for me today is that collection of layered narratives that we have told over time. And it turns out that depending on time and depending on place, where you are, and for what purpose you are speaking of family, you tell the story you can tell, you tell the story you need to tell. And that, to me, turned out to be something I wanted to preserve rather than flatten out. I think as a historian, I might have said, now I'm going to tell you, with my omniscience, the true story or the correct story. I'm going to set the record straight. But I turned out that one version of what family is a collection of stories. And we don't tell the same stories in every generation. And I wanted to not only preserve those stories, I wanted to understand why it was that in my grandfather's generation, they erased, for example, some of the enslaved people in our family past. Well, why? How did they come to do that, and why? And how is it then in our generation we tell those stories with some difficulty, but also with some pride? And that is, for me, it turns out, a version of what family is. It is a collection of these stories, and it doesn't mean the same thing in every generation, even though we all suffer, and I will say, I think we all suffer with the metaphor of the tree, right, and that kind of exhaustive thoroughness, but in fact, we mostly live with parts of those stories, and they are stories for our own time.
You gestured just now to the idea of generations and that the stories are situated, they're produced, each generation for its own. And I wonder if I could just kind of gesture to a couple of the other moments where this question, who do you think you are, appears in the book in one way or another. There's an 1885 dance for young colored people in Danville. And the white newspaper reports on this dance and mocks it, basically asking rhetorically, who do they think they are? Wearing silks, putting on beautiful clothes to go dancing. And then in 1957, the sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, prominent African-American sociologist, judges essentially your Aunt Musie and her generation in his book, Black Bourgeoisie. Again, who did she think she was? And then at the very end, there's a restaurant server who asks you this same question, but then there's sort of the funny denouement, which is that the server actually doesn't really care about race. The server's just thinking something else completely. And so it seemed to me that these questions at different places in the book revealed more about the questioner, the person who is gazing and attempting to deduce who you are, what you are, and then about the person who's actually being gazed at. And you use these moments to reverse the gaze, to stare back at the looker and their motivations, the historical context in which they made these judgments. So I guess I kind of wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what each of these questions reveals about the questioner and about the historical moment in which they asked their question. Maybe start with the Danville newspaper.
Sure. The young woman in the silk party dress is my grandmother's mother, Fanny. And Fanny is of the Emancipation generation. She's born in 1862 or 1863. She, by the time this party takes place in downtown Danville, she's been to college, to Berea College. She's herself a teacher. And she is part of a very self-conscious community or class of young black people in small town Kentucky who are looking to make their marks on the world in the wake of slavery's abolition, on the coattails, such as they are, of Reconstruction. And, you know, who do you think you are is the question that puts you in your place, right? That is intended to remind you that there are rules and there are boundaries and there are social codes, and they don't necessarily include young black women, the daughters of slaves, in essence, wearing finery and gathering for a, you know, I imagine the scene, you know, it's sort of the music is wafting out into the street from the downtown venue. It's all very, you know, gay and lighthearted and beautiful, in fact. But the question then from the journalist, right, is meant to be a disciplining one, right, a disciplining one.
And the disciplining is not just cultural or social, it's political, isn't it, at that moment, 1885, right? That the idea that young African Americans could have the wherewithal to do these things, to think of these things, to rent out a hall in public space, it's a claim to publicness, to public citizenship that is being questioned here. It's more than just raining on their fun. What about E. Franklin Frazier? What does that moment, that question, reveal about Frazier and his world, which I guess I'll characterize as being the 1930s, 40s, 50s?
Yeah. I mean, so Frazier's question really is about stratification and hierarchy among and between black Americans. He is taking stock in part of the generation that W.E.B. Du Bois termed the talented 10th. He is provoked by the emergence of a black middle class, a black elite by the middle of the 20th century. He sees a correlation, in his view, between the rise of this elite and skin color in particular, which is to say, it is not only that people have education and that they have vocations and that they own property, but they all appear to be light and lighter skinned. And so Frazier's question is, in its own way, intended to take those folks, including my grandparents, down more than a few notches, as only a, you know, sharp-penned social scientist can do, right? You know, Frazier is brilliant. He is resident in this world, and so he knows it well. And, you know, his critique is that black Americans are losing the thread, right? The thread, in Frazier's view, is one about the the welfare and the well-being and the progress of the race. And what he thinks he observes are people who are preoccupied with clothes and automobiles and the trapping of bourgeois life. And, you know, I don't read this book until the 1990s, and I'm blown away in the 1990s. And then I try and get in the head of my grandmother, who would have read it in the 50s and understand how it would have struck her to have Fraser, someone she knew and someone she had held in certainly high esteem, come for her and come for people like her. And I think, I mean, the last thing to say is, and I think, in my view, right, I think there's Fraser's seeing some things and he's also missing some things, right? And so part of my work is to try and recover how she might have responded to his provocation.
Yeah, and I think it's just a few pages later where you kind of, I think, show us your grandmother in a way responding to Fraser's provocation. There's this incredible scene toward the end of the book where this question comes again, this time, as you say, wrapped in kindness and concern. So here is your grandmother with another close family friend. And the question that is put to you, I think, right, is, children, who here is a Negro?
The hand goes up, the hand goes up.
Yeah, right. And so you're the first one to put your hand up. You find out later because you were
Who do
too
you
young.
think you are?
Who do you think you are?
A loving question.
A loving question.
Right, from a grandmother who is worried that not only by virtue of how we appear to the eyes of strangers, but because we're being raised in a predominantly and overwhelmingly predominantly white suburb of New York City, she is concerned that not only we must know who we are, and we must be armed with a strong sense of our identity, lest we forget it, but lest we be misunderstood by the world. And she gets into a tussle with an interviewer who is trying to put labels on us, and that tells us something about time, right? Which is to say, Fraser in the 50s had all kinds of labels available to him for, you know, what I'm going to today call so-called light-skinned Black Americans, mixed race Black Americans. But by the 1970s, when my grandmother is now being asked the question, you know, who do you think your grandchildren are? She doesn't really have a language or a vocabulary for who we are. It's somewhere between, you know, the old language of mulatto and before we get to, you know, 21st century mixed race. And she just doesn't like the question at all, right? She just doesn't like the question at all.
It's clear. It's clear she doesn't like it. And there's this whole... I think one of the threads, and it's related to what we've been talking about, this whole thread about passing. And, you know, passing is this really fraught term in American history and culture. It's usually framed. It's usually framed as a voluntary act, something that a person does on purpose, right? So-and-so passed. And you describe many acts of passing. It's often unclear in these pages whether the person is passing or being passed, and if they are passing, whether they're doing it on purpose or accidentally, or even what their intention is, because they seem to have all sorts of different motivations. So I guess first, maybe tell us an example of passing that occurs in the book, and then tell us something about what you think passing reveals about the world and the eras that you're recounting here.
Well, I'll take us back to Fanny, because we've mentioned her, my grandmother's mother, who spends much of her adult life in the city of St. Louis, Missouri. And Fanny is a woman who, when it suits her, um, puts on her, her good frock and heads to downtown St. Louis, and she shops where she pleases, and she sits in the theater seat that pleases her, and she tricks the eye. That's my phrase, right? She tricks the eye, and she knows she can. She delights in it. She thinks it's a facet of her resistance to the Jim Crow regime that has segregated downtown St. Louis and so many cities like it. And I was terrified to spend time with Fanny, even on the page, because I understood that I am not so unlike Fanny, which is to say that I can trick the eye, mislead the eye, not sure how I'm being regarded and whether the courtesy being extended to me is because someone apprehends me or misapprehends me. But Fanny is not somebody who, I think in the way we often think about passing, is someone who passes right into another world, never to be seen or recovered again. On Saturday afternoon, she shops as she pleases. She's able to try on clothes and things. But what's important in her story, for me, is my own grandmother, her daughter, who cannot trick the eye, does not trick the eye generally. And what that means is that between mother and daughter, passing is also a very painful facet of how they move through the world. And my grandmother, in essence, is left behind on those days when Fanny wants to be in the department store and be regarded as a white woman or sit in the movie theater. And I think for me it was important to allow both things to be true, if that makes sense, right? Because sometimes I think passing is also offered as a kind of reductionist, right, way of assessing somebody and telling us who they are in the world. And I think Fanny, was a complicated person. Maybe we all are, but I think it was true that there was something very deliberate and very subversive about what she did in downtown St. Louis. And it was also true that it was very hurtful to her oldest daughter.
That story is messy. It's a mess. And some of the best history it doesn't shy away from those messes. And there's something deeply human and humane about the way that you write about the folks on these pages. I wonder if maybe I could ask you a bit about your research process. How, if you would, how was it similar to or different from the research that went into your other books?
I mean, it's very different, especially at the beginning, because I'm finally going through all those shoeboxes and bins and envelopes full of things that my beloved husband has been carting around America for years. This is the last time I'm moving this box unless you do something with it. So I'm really for the first time very concertedly looking at what's in there. I don't know, if you have a stash of family things, maybe you only look at a handful of them ever, right? Maybe you've chosen a few that the photographs that you put in a frame, and a lot of it remains untouched. So it was the first time that I'm going through those materials. And I thought initially that would be the research. And maybe I'd be helped a little by some census returns and things like that, but that basically I was going to use the family materials. But there are, of course, holes and lapses in those materials, some of which are people stopped writing letters by the 60s as the telephone gets cheaper and cheaper, and you can see, the letter says, we spoke last Sunday, and then you realize, oh no, the letters are falling away now, and and the phone calls are lost to us. So there are lots of gaps, and the trouble for me is now, am I going to, for example, am I going to resort to the records of enslavers, people who enslaved members of my family? Am I going to use those materials at all? I hadn't intended to. I think initially I felt they were tainted. I felt they were troubled. And I wouldn't have felt that way as a historian, but as a descendant, I definitely felt like I don't really want to commune, right, with some of the folks who were part of this world. But in the end, it takes me a long time, a decade and more, before I use those kinds of materials. And it won't be a surprise to anyone that those materials are more oftentimes preserved and cared for and accessible to us today, even as other of my family materials are long gone. I guess the last thing I'll say is that, but working that way meant that I developed for me a healthy and a new kind of skepticism about the official record. I was somebody who took the census at, generally speaking, face value. I took death certificates at face value, pension records at face value, all these official documents that are designed precisely to persuade us that they are kind of true and objective and just the facts. And I began to realize that, not unlike the ledgers of an enslaver, the ledgers of a census taker are just another story, right? Told by a man who's working with a set of parameters, and but who arrives at someone's home and sizes people up and asks questions or doesn't ask questions and begins to fill in boxes, and people are sometimes being forthcoming and sometimes they're not being forthcoming. And so I tried in the end to sort of trouble even those kinds of ministerial documents, and recognize that they weren't more or less stories just like the letters and the diaries and the family lore that gets passed down. They're just other stories.
You do such a beautiful job of making that query, I think. For those of you who engage with history in one way or another, you probably know that, like lawyers, historians are taught that there's kind of a hierarchy of evidence. And at the top of that hierarchy sit written government documents. Those are the ones you're supposed to trust. Somewhere near the bottom are like oral narratives, especially oral narratives of enslaved people. What do they know about their history? And so, here on page 44, this is a moment where you say, I'd arrived at a crossroads. The historian in me knew well how to rely on the recollections of clerks, census takers, and petty officials. But you end that paragraph by saying, it was time for me to really listen to these women in her family whose stories have been handed down from generation to generation. And you give their stories as much or more weight than the government documents. One of the things that drives that point home is something that you just did in summary a minute ago, is you show us the government documents in the moment of their creation. You bring us into the spot where the census taker encounters the head of household or whoever happens to be home when the census taker knocks, and you show us this official document being created. And that has the effect of showing us that it is, in fact, just as you said, a story. It's an authoritative one. It carries weight in official circles, but it's not natural. It's not handed down by God. Now, I wanted to just ask you a little bit about another thing that I think you're trying to tell us about official and semi-official documents, which is about their context. And I'll just quote to you here something that you wrote. The documents I sometimes read though neat and elegantly scripted, had their origins in brutal force. And then you quote Nell Painter as admonishing you, remember the blood on the page. What does that mean, blood on the page?
I think anybody who's ever, stayed up late at night and, scrolled on some online service through, ship manifests or immigration records or censuses knows something about how seductive they are. And I have myself been seduced by them. But they're so clean, they're so neat, and as I do, that oftentimes the records that get preserved and digitized and we encounter online aren't even the originals, right? That they have been rewritten so that they look even more formal, even more authoritative than the original document that a census taker might have hurriedly scribbled on. I think what Nell Painter's admonition to us is reminding us that there are the conditions under which the document is created, and then there are the conditions under which the document is created, right? Which is to say, a slaveholder's ledger, right, is created by a man. Perhaps it's the enslaver himself. Perhaps it's a clerk or an employee. Perhaps it's a lawyer or a court clerk. And we can interrogate that process and see the vagaries, on the page itself. But I think what Painter is saying is that those pages are only created because there is a world of force, of compulsion, of violence that means some people have access to the paper and some of us never have access to the paper. This to me is wisdom for dealing with the documents that so many of us deal with. But it's wisdom, I think, in that passage also for what it means when we visit historic sites and beautifully restored historic homes and more. You might forget that the real context that created them was, in my story, the violence of slavery. And even when you say the words and you see them on the page, you might forget how troubled the circumstances are that produce those documents. And isn't that what, in a family story, isn't that what you want to be sure you don't leave behind?
And sometimes I got the feeling there were some stories that went untold, not only by your family members, but also by you. And so I wonder, there are moments when we see family members of yours not saying things. Other times they write things down. I guess I sort of wonder, how did you decide what to remember and what to forget as you came, especially to you writing about your own parents' generation and about your own?
Memoir as a writing genre was new to me. So I'm indebted, to teachers who understand the genre and imparted to me their views of the ethics of the genre. So in this sense, I consider myself a student of writers like Natasha Trethewey and Casey Lehman, who I'm not even paraphrasing, but the lesson partly I took was, if you're not writing about the most difficult things, why are you writing at all? And so I think you're coming back to that commitment again and again. I had an editor who, and this is, you'll appreciate this, I had an editor, who every time I would fill the pages with beautiful context and, historical stage setting, would say, so what are you avoiding? What are you avoiding now, right? Because, that's what historians, we know how to do, right? We know how to elide a whole lot, perhaps because it's not relevant to our argument, perhaps because there's a hole or a gap and that we don't know how to fill. But she called it cheating. You're cheating, and you're not telling us what's really on your mind. So I can't say that I have excavated every corner of my psyche, but I think again and again, and as with most books, this version represents, I don't know, the 6th or 7th iteration. I needed that many iterations to finally get to what I thought the essence was. That having been said, I also wanted to respect, not to the ultimate degree, but I wanted to show respect for people in this story for whom silence and the leaving out was a very important part of their strategies for making their way, for surviving, for building the lives that they sought to build. I had to make peace with them because I was going to tell things that they had decided not to tell. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. I'm going to close with a pair of questions about a term that you use to frame the book. You frame it as a two-sided dialogue. One, I think, is a dialogue with your family, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the other is a dialogue with historians. Now, usually, if you're a nerdy historian like I am, you look at the footnotes to find out something about the dialogue that you're having with other professional historians. But they're not here because this is not that kind of book. So I wonder if you can point to maybe one or two key scholarly themes or ideas or assumptions that you're building on in this book or questioning in this book about the ways that professional historians have talked about U.S. history.
This is nobody's ever asked me that. That's very good, Dylan. Thank you.
Sorry.
No. Which is my way of filibustering because I don't think I have an answer to that. We've talked about passing, for example, and there's an important and beautiful and very insightful literature that comes from historians and fellow travelers about passing. And yet I think that the one of the values or one of the things that historians might take from family history is not unlike the insights we take from biography or microhistory, which is to say these are stories that largely do not conform with the kind of sociological thinking that frequently informs the way in which we explain the past as historians. So for me, in a way, the challenge was really to set aside the sociological thinking and to resist the urge to transform lives into sociological wisdom, right? And so in a way that's not here, I appreciate that maybe I'm so much of a historian, I don't know how to think in ways that are sort of beyond, wholly beyond, the historiography and the debates that we have. But if I could put it, one of the pleasures of this book was not being obliged to historiography exactly, knowing that if there's a part of this book that is something that you're deeply familiar with, you may feel me speaking to you or even arguing with you. But I want to reassure you, I'm not really arguing with you very much at all. I'm trying to get out of that, and that's one of the reasons why there are no footnotes, right? Is because my challenge is to persuade you on the page, and not persuade you by virtue of you flipping back to the references to decide whether or not you think I got it right. Either I get it right on the page or I don't get it right at all.
That comes through. I get what you're saying. The feeling of it comes through so powerfully. And one of the feelings, and I'll end with this question, that you put front and center is longing. And you describe that as the motivation, or it emanates, you say, from longing. You say, near the end of the book, it was my chance to talk again with ancestors, to revive our conversations, and to begin new ones. And in the closing pages, you actually address your mom and dad in sort of like a pair of letters, really heartfelt and deeply personal letters to them. So my last question for you is about your the way that your family has been receiving your book. What have they said? What impact did the researching of this book and the writing of this book, because I know you spoke with many of them, have on your relationship with your family? And now that they've had a chance to read it, what's been their reaction?
I hope they've read it. I'm not sure.
They're going to read it.
They bought it. And,
they bought it. That's good enough.
If they read it. I think I've been very fortunate. I have a whole crew of cousins in my generation, most of whom came out for my very first book event. It was terrifying, actually, because they were sort of sitting right there, and very moving, right, to talk about this book in front of them. And I was afraid that what they wanted was a romance. What they wanted was hagiography. They wanted a book that went down easy and that affirmed us as the very special people that we think we are. I was afraid that they wanted that, and this book is not that. I think it's fair to say. So that makes it even all the more moving, right, that they have been so open and appreciative and have come on this journey with me. I have a brother who read this in manuscript, and he stopped reading before the last two chapters, because the last two chapters included people that he had known, our parents, grandparents, and it was hard for him. It was, I think, painful. And so that's okay too. And he came back weeks and weeks and weeks later and finally finished it. And I could relate to that because it took me a long time to write it, and to actually confront the material. I have one family member who was very disturbed that I would, in particular, the last chapter, which is about my father, talk about my father and his own personal troubles in very open and frank ways. And so we disagree about that, and that, I think, is also the nature of family, that we don't all think in the same ways about which story should be told and why and what it means. I hope that what I was able to do was to tell all these stories, including his story, with not only respect, but with compassion and with tenderness is a word that a friend gave me, not because I made them pretty or beautiful or cleaned them up, but because I tried to tell them with, in a striving for understanding about who people were and the lives that they lived. But I understand not everybody will see it quite that way. Can I say, so a funny thing is, in my hometown, the Retired Teachers Association has a book club, and they've assigned the book for their September book club meeting. And I can't decide whether I want to know, like, what my high school English teacher thinks of the book. Not the prose, but like my rendering of the story, right? Because I think it's a shock for many people, to really be inside somebody's head, even somebody you know really well, right? Now you're like way in my head, and there's an awkwardness, I think, about, like, is that what you were thinking? Is that what was preoccupying you like all those years ago? And it's true. And I didn't always share that. And I think so for my teachers, for my family, even for friends, there are not surprises as in shocks, just a kind of sustained reflection from me about who I am and where I come from, that I've never had the capacity to express, in its full form. That's why we write books.
That's why we write books. We write books, for all kinds of reasons, but one of the things that I loved so much about this book is that your love for your family comes out on every page. It is a beautiful, a deeply moving book, and I strongly urge everyone here and out there online to get yourself a copy as soon as you can. The Trouble of Color, Martha Jones. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan.
So let's use that microphone as longer, and then maybe you can switch. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter.
So.
Thank you.
Yes.
Martha, I'm interested a little bit more in the sort of chronology of the writing of the book. It sounds like a 10-year process, but it must have. But just give me a sense of how that took place over a 10-year period.
Sure. I started by doing some short experimental writing. The very first piece that has survived in this book was an essay I wrote for CNN in 2014 for Black History Month, and they gave it the title Black and Also Biracial, or Biracial and Also Black, I don't remember, but that was the first time that I wrote in the first person for a broad audience, and it was mostly a reflection on race and its social construction and how it has shifted across generations, and was kind of goes from my young life in the 50s and 60s to the lives of our students in the beginning of the 21st century. And two things happened, but one was I got to experience what it was like to put myself on the page, and with a wonderful editor, Alicia Stewart. But the essay went viral, as we say, and it had, within a week, 8 or 9 million hits. And honestly, that freaked me out. I wasn't sure I wanted to be that visible, and that I wanted, and my editor encouraged me to go into the comments section. Now we say don't read the comments. She was like, read the comments. I want you to go in. I want you to wade in. I want you to reply to people. It was very intense, and they had me write a follow-up piece. But that was a long time ago, and I was at best ambivalent, in the wake of that experience, because I understood that something happens, or can happen, when you put yourself on the page, which is people come to you with their own stories and their own selves. And that was a lot, and I had never experienced that. So I've done some of that kind of writing over the years, as a way of trying some of that on, and letting my family, read these short pieces, letting them kind of, they also, that essay had photographs of my siblings in it, and so that was their debut into this weird world of like writing and race and history. But we all had to try it on a little bit to see how it fit. But the other thing that's happening is that as I'm finding new archival materials, like a complaint that my great-grandmother writes to the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867. She's been abandoned by the father of her children, who was also the man who owned her. And I put that down for many, many years. I had to read a lot more and learn a lot more before I could understand and begin to be in any way insightful about the story that she related to the Freedmen's Bureau and the life that she lived that led her to that moment. I had to, read over and over again Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, right? Because Jacobs is telling her own version of that story. And so it takes time. It takes time. Yeah. Thank you for that. Thanks.
Thanks. That was really, really interesting. And you raise so many profound issues about belonging in everything that you say. And issues that I'm sure have to do with many families of many sorts. So this is less a question than a kind of asking you to comment further on one way of seeing what was being asked in that question, who do you think you are, which is saying, at least as I'm hearing the incidents in which you were asked that, which side are you on? And implying that there are two sides, that there is a racial divide, and so on. And so it does sound to me like your story is about not wanting yourself to make that divide, but being forced by the way the world has been and is to make that divide. So I just wondered if you would comment more on that point of view.
Thank you for that. Because I think you're perceiving something that I have thought a lot about. The question, who do you think you are, is not the same as what are you? I've been asked that a million times in my life by the time I had that confrontation. And, that's a schoolyard question. Everybody gets asked a version of what are you? But this was more pointed. And of course, it was in a historical moment in which what it means to, what the color line means in 1976 is not what it meant a half century before, but it had really, I took, in part, it's a political question, right? And coming out of the politics of the wake of civil rights, the wake of Black Power. So I think we could think about it that way. I guess at the same time, as I have, if another version of the question is like, what race are you, right? Even today, I think, I have like 14 answers to that question, right? I don't mean to sound silly or even confused. It's just to say that I think of myself as a Black American, but I understand that just someone who is asking me, who do you think you are, that is an inadequate response to that question. They want to understand, why do you look the way you do? why do you speak the way you do? You know, why do you come to this scene in the way you come? And that's why I resort ultimately to the family story, because I think that it is only through the family story that you can understand some of the literal questions. How do I come to look the way I do? Why do I appear the way I do? But also, what does it mean, right? What does it mean? And, you know, my parents were married in 1957. They marry across the color line. And I had thought that they were to blame. If there's blame to be meted out, why not, right? I mean, that's part of the undercurrent question, right? Is like, who's responsible for this travesty? And I thought they were to blame. But in writing this book and learning more about, you know, much earlier generations, part of what I discover is that, you know, crossing or troubling the color line is a long-standing dimension of this particular family story. But I think that there's for me, a bigger point, and maybe this goes to Dylan's earlier question, and that is that I came to think of this story as a very American story. And by that, I mean not only because it's set in historical place and time, but because if I were asked the sociological question, what is the American family? The American family is this very sort of hybrid, confused, mixed, you know, category confounding thing. And part of what's been fascinating about traveling and talking about the book is the way in which folks are sharing their family stories, and they just are never ones that conform with some neat sociological, you know, schematic of who we are. And you may come from a family whose troubles are related to race and color. It may be that you come from a family whose troubles are related to faith. You know, my mother was a Catholic and my father was a Methodist. And that was almost as problematic in 1957 as he being black and she being white, so-called white. You know, today who isn't attached to some blended family, right? That means who you call family and what your family encompasses is so much more far-reaching than the conventional tree or lines of blood or DNA might suggest to us. And so I think that for me, part of the takeaway really was that I grew up thinking that a family like mine was aberrant, was out of keeping, was illegible almost in an American family lexicon. And I think what writing the book and then talking to people about it taught me was that actually it's a version of the American family story. And I had dinner with at George Washington's Mount Vernon with folks who are daughters of the American Revolution and those descendants of the Mayflower. Well, get them talking with a glass of wine about family, and they will tell you that there's a lot more in their families than even those pedigrees, those treasured, and hard fought for pedigrees ever account for. And so, in a time where I think we have such profound questions about what makes us Americans, it has been really moving for me to realize that there's a story about family, and that when we get to talking about family, it's not all easy and it's not all beautiful, but it really is that complexity that binds us to one another. And if we're not related in this generation, our children and our grandchildren will make sure that we're related in the next, because they are often doing that. And that's not simply beautiful or simply easy. I don't mean to put a gloss on it, but I've come to really believe that's part of who we are collectively. And that's new for me, to feel part of an American story and not on the margins. Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's very brave of you to tell your story and to write it. I think that multiculturalism is very hard to talk about because people like to see things black or white type of thinking, and they have a really hard time tolerating that ambiguity. And it tends to isolate others. I know because I myself am multicultural, where my mother was Mexican and my father was white American from Chicago. So it's very hard for me. I myself am Mexican and indigenous identified, but I do understand that it is a personal choice. And what you chose to identify with is great. I mean, I think that takes a... But what really strikes me in my own experience is the isolation, that either culture will reject me. So the white American would see me as Mexican, and the Mexican would see me as white American, and either one wanted to take responsibility or tolerate that ambiguity or that complexity. And that was very painful to me because I felt like, why can't I take the richness of either one and integrate it? And I felt that that's what you have done through your journey. Thank you.
I thank you for that. And for sharing with us some of your own story. This is what I was suggesting to Nancy is happening, you know, and I'm not a fan of the U.S. Census as the vehicle for, you know, our self-actualization as individuals, or as a nation, but I am someone who believes in our stories, right, and the power of our stories to help us see one another and to know one another, but also I think to see ourselves. I don't want to assume too much, but I think I was also someone who grew up with a great deal of shame, you know, because I didn't seem to fit, and my family didn't seem to fit, right, into what seemed to be conventional notions. And when we think about, like, what is race, what is color, you know, the lie, right? Part of the lie is that, you know, people should be pure, right, and of one or another, and that we have to choose, right? All of those to me are sort of the myths and the lies of race and color. But writing the book for me was a way of letting go of some of that shame. You know, the thing I won in writing this book that I never would have expected was a sense of humor, you know, about the absurdity of some of it. You know, like that moment with those wonderful young women in the restaurant in Montgomery, you know, I every time I think of that story, I laugh. I never thought I could laugh about a moment like that, but there was something about, and that's the title has two meanings, right? The trouble, we've talked a lot about trouble in its most conventional sense, but trouble is also comes from a spiritual wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's going to trouble the waters. And that comes from the book of John. And in the book of John, it's the angels that trouble the waters. And we are invited to step into the trouble. Because when we step into the troubled waters, we are healed. And so for me, I think that there was a real healing in stepping into this family story, stepping into the past, stepping into the difficulty, no longer avoiding it, no longer, you know, sort of, you know, hanging out, you know, on the shore and hoping I might not get caught. It turned out when I stepped all the way in, it changed something in me. It didn't have the same power it had had over me as an individual. And that's something I just never would have anticipated. So I really believe, and I thank you again for sharing your bit of the story. I think there's something healing in that for some of us.
So I think we have time for one more line of inquiry, and I saw you taking notes, Professor Penningroth.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, goodness. I was jotting down a note to myself about some answers that you gave to the questions above. But I guess, if I'm going to ask a last question, then I suppose that I couldn't do worse than to ask about another form of belonging, which you and I have talked about recently, and which gets at the book that you wrote previous to this, Birthright Citizens. When we think about color and family, a lot of the time what we're really talking about is being claimed and the ability to be claimed by a collective. And of course, today we have powerful government officials who are challenging the idea that some people have membership in the body politic, that they can be citizens. And I guess, maybe you could close with just a word about that form of belonging, the argument that's being made, and why it's wrong.
I'm going to give the memoirist's answer and not the legal historian's answer, because there's a moment in this book, it's during the Civil War, and those of my grandmother's family who are enslaved in Danville, Kentucky, experience what was harrowing for so many enslaved people. The person who owned them, who called them property, dies, and now there's an estate proceeding. And my grandmother's grandmother, Susan, is there in that household with 2 and then 3 small children, all subject to the law, a law that gives these heirs to their owner the prerogative to place them where they will, sell them if they desire. So for me, I have been thinking a lot about this history of the separation of families, the way in which law can violate some of the most intimate, essential, and enduring relationships, and do it, right, by way of the rule of law. And so this is a one lens through which I think about our current moment as families, many of them, including immigrant members of those families, are facing being asked to, by law, consider and confront their separation by way of this proposed abrogation of birthright citizenship. The bigger story, of course, that I tell in that book is about how Black Americans struggle very deliberately and over many, many decades to articulate and to promote the birthright principle that becomes constitutionalized in what is today the very controversial 14th Amendment. But I think that we all have a stake in this historical moment when families around us are being asked to make the impossible choices about who stays and who goes, who's in and who's out, who do we call family, what does family mean, right? And it can't only be blood and DNA and trees, right? It is these human scenes that our friends, our neighbors, our families are confronting. So that's not the legal historian's answer exactly, but as you know, and as you so exemplify in your work, we know that the history of law really resides in the lives of those people who are grappling with the law. So maybe it is a legal historian's answer after all.
I think that's a beautiful way for us to close our session. I just want to give one more thank you to Martha Jones for being here today. It's an incredible book, and I can't praise it anymore. It's just wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. And thanks, City Lights.